I've been investigating missing persons cases for over 15 years, and I can tell you that some disappearances haunt you more than others. The Jensen family case from 1984 is one of those stories that keeps you awake at night, not because of what happened, but because of what we found carved into a cliff face 9 years later. My name is Detective Sarah Morrison, and I was part of the original search team that combed the Sierra Nevada mountains, looking for 4 people who seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was July 15th, 1984, when Michael Jensen, his wife Linda, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Emma and 8-year-old David, set out for what should have been a simple day hike on the Mist Trail near Yosemite. Michael was a software engineer from San Francisco, methodical and careful by nature. Linda taught elementary school and had hiked these trails dozens of times before. The kids were experienced hikers for their age, having grown up camping and exploring the California wilderness with their parents every summer since they could walk. The weather that morning was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-70s, with just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. According to the ranger station logs, the Jensen family signed in at 7:23 a.m., stating their intended route and expected return time of 4 p.m. Michael had packed enough water and snacks for the day, plus emergency supplies. Linda had her camera, excited to photograph the wildflowers that were particularly vibrant that season. Emma brought her journal, where she documented every family adventure. David carried his own small backpack, proud to contribute to the family's gear. What made this case particularly unsettling from the beginning was how prepared they were. These weren't inexperienced tourists who had wandered off the beaten path unprepared. The Jensens knew these mountains. They had permits, proper gear, and had filed a detailed hiking plan with the rangers. Michael had even called his brother the night before, excitedly describing their planned route and promising to call when they returned to their hotel. That call never came. When they failed to return by 6 p.m., the hotel staff initially wasn't concerned. Hikers often returned later than planned, especially families with children who might stop frequently to rest or explore. But by 8 p.m., when Michael hadn't called his brother as promised, concern began to mount. The hotel manager contacted the ranger station, and by 10 p.m., the first search teams were being organized. Park rangers who knew the Jensen family personally were among the first volunteers, and their worry was palpable. The initial search began at dawn on July 16th. Ranger Tom Kellerman, who had checked them in the previous morning, led the primary team along their intended route. I joined the search effort on day 2, bringing our department's tracking dogs and additional personnel. What we found in those first 48 hours defied explanation. The family's tracks were clearly visible for the first 2 miles of the trail, but then they simply stopped. Not gradually, not at a stream crossing or rocky area where tracks might naturally disappear. They just ended, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The dogs picked up their scent along the established trail, but lost it at exactly the same point where the footprints vanished. We expanded the search radius, thinking perhaps they had taken an unmarked side trail or decided to explore off the main path. Teams combed every ravine, every creek bed, every possible route they might have taken. Helicopters searched from above, their pilots scanning for any sign of bright clothing or camping gear. The search continued for 2 weeks, involving over 200 volunteers and professional rescue teams from 3 counties. What troubled us most was the complete absence of any evidence. No torn clothing caught on branches, no dropped items, no disturbed vegetation indicating they had passed through. It was as if 4 people had simply ceased to exist at a specific point on a well-traveled trail. The last hikers to see them were a young couple from Los Angeles who passed them around 9:30 a.m. The couple remembered them clearly because Emma had helped them identify a bird they'd never seen before. They described the Jensen family as happy, energetic, and completely normal. Local media coverage was extensive. The San Francisco Chronicle ran the story on the front page for 3 consecutive days. Television news crews arrived from Sacramento and Los Angeles, setting up near the trailhead to interview search teams and park officials. The story captured public attention because the family seemed so ordinary, so prepared, so unlikely to simply vanish. Tips poured in from across California, each one investigated thoroughly, but none led anywhere meaningful. As the official search wound down after 2 weeks, the theories began. Some suggested they had fallen into an unmapped cave system, though geological surveys showed no significant underground caverns in the area. Others proposed they had been attacked by a mountain lion or bear, but there were no signs of animal activity and no blood evidence. The most disturbing theory, whispered among some of the search volunteers, was that they had encountered someone with malicious intent, though no suspicious individuals had been reported in the area. The case file remained open, but active investigation ceased after 6 months. Michael's brother hired private investigators who continued searching for another year, following leads that took them as far as Oregon and Nevada. The Jensen family home in San Francisco remained exactly as they had left it, mortgage payments automatically deducted from their bank account for months until the money ran out. Linda's school district kept her position open for the entire following school year, hoping she would somehow return to her 3rd-grade classroom. The mystery consumed the local hiking community. Trail registers in the months following their disappearance were filled with hikers asking if anyone had seen the Jensen family or found any new clues. Some hikers began avoiding the mist trail altogether, spooked by stories of the family who had simply vanished into the mountain mist. Others became obsessed with the case, returning repeatedly to search areas that professional teams had already covered multiple times. By the winter of 1984, the Jensen case had begun to fade from public consciousness, relegated to a file drawer in the county sheriff's office and a memorial page in the local newspaper's annual review. But for those of us who had been there, who had searched every inch of that mountain, the mystery never truly disappeared. It lingered in the back of our minds like an itch we couldn't scratch, a puzzle with missing pieces that we couldn't stop trying to solve. I kept the case file on my desk for 3 years, reviewing it during quiet moments, looking for something we might have missed. The photographs from the search still disturbed me. Images of the trail where their footprints simply ended, shots of their hotel room exactly as they had left it, with Linda's reading glasses on the nightstand and David's favorite stuffed animal waiting on his bed. The ranger station logbook page, with Michael's careful handwriting, became almost iconic in missing persons circles, copied and studied by investigators from other jurisdictions dealing with similar unexplained disappearances. What kept bothering me was the precision of where the trail went cold. In 15 years of search and rescue work, I had never encountered anything quite like it. Usually there are gradual signs, tracks becoming fainter, evidence spreading out as people separate or become disoriented. But the Jensen family's evidence simply stopped at exactly the same point for all 4 individuals. The tracking dogs, some of the best in the state, had never encountered anything like it either. Their handlers described the dog's behavior as confused, almost frustrated, as if the scent had been deliberately erased. The spot where the trail went cold became known locally as Jensen Point, though it wasn't marked on any official maps. Hikers would stop there, some leaving flowers or small memorials. A few claimed to feel an unusual coldness or heaviness in the air at that exact location. Rangers dismissed these reports as psychological suggestion, but I noticed that several of the search dogs, even years later, showed unusual behavior when passing that spot on other search missions. The family's extended relatives never stopped looking. Michael's brother David, named after his nephew, established a reward fund that eventually grew to $50,000. He organized annual search efforts, bringing in volunteers from as far away as Canada and Mexico. Psychics and amateur investigators contacted the family constantly, most with well-meaning but ultimately useless theories. A few claimed to have had visions or dreams about the family's fate, but none provided information that led to any concrete discoveries. In 1987, 3 years after the disappearance, there was a brief resurgence of hope when human remains were discovered in a remote canyon about 15 miles from the missed trail. The bones appeared to be from a family group, 2 adults and 2 children, and had been there for several years. For 2 weeks, the media coverage was intense as forensic experts worked to identify the remains. DNA testing was not yet available for routine use, so identification relied on dental records and personal effects found with the bodies. The devastating news came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The remains belonged to a different family entirely, the Morrison family from Oregon, who had disappeared in 1982 while attempting an unauthorized climb of a nearby peak. While this discovery brought closure to another grieving family, it crushed the hope that the Jensen case had finally been solved. The similarities between the 2 cases, complete families vanishing without a trace in the Sierra Nevada, raised new questions about whether there might be a pattern or common cause. By 1988, I had been promoted to detective sergeant and was primarily handling current cases, but the Jensen file never left my office. I had developed a theory that something specific about that location that day had contributed to their disappearance. I studied weather patterns, geological surveys, even wildlife migration data, looking for any anomaly that might explain what had happened. Nothing in the official records suggested anything unusual about July 15, 1984. The case had become legendary among hikers and outdoor enthusiasts. Camping stores in the region sold detailed maps that marked the Jensen family's last known location. Hiking guidebooks included cautionary tales about their disappearance, usually recommending that hikers always inform multiple people about their plans and carry emergency beacons. The irony wasn't lost on anyone familiar with the case. The Jensens had done everything right, followed every safety protocol, and had still vanished without explanation. Local Native American tribal elders, when asked about the area, would sometimes mention old stories about certain places in the mountains where people could step between worlds. Most dismissed these as folklore, but I found myself wondering if there might be some factual basis behind the legends. The Miwok and Paiute peoples had lived in these mountains for thousands of years. Perhaps they had observed phenomena that modern science couldn't yet explain. In 1989, 5 years after the disappearance, Michael's brother made one final public appeal. He held a press conference at the exact spot where the family had signed in at the ranger station, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. He announced that he was establishing a scholarship fund in the family's name and would continue searching for answers as long as he lived. The assembled media was smaller than in previous years, but his determination was undiminished. The scholarship fund became the Jensen family's lasting legacy, helping dozens of young people pursue careers in outdoor education and wilderness conservation. Emma would have been 17 by then, possibly a senior in high school thinking about college. David would have been 13, probably discovering new interests and developing the personality that his family would never get to see fully emerge. Linda would have been teaching another generation of third graders, and Michael would have been adapting to the rapidly changing world of computer technology. As the 1980s ended and the 1990s began, the Jensen case settled into the category of cold cases that investigators occasionally revisited but never expected to solve. New missing persons cases demanded attention, new technologies offered hope for solving other mysteries, and the Jensen family began their slow fade into the realm of local legend and cautionary tale. The early 1990s brought significant changes to missing persons investigations. DNA testing became more widely available, and new search technologies began to emerge. I had been promoted to lead detective by then, overseeing a team that handled cold cases throughout the county. The Jensen file had followed me through 3 office moves and 2 promotions, a constant reminder of the case that had shaped my approach to every investigation since. In 1991, we received what seemed like a promising lead. A hiker in Colorado contacted our office, claiming to have encountered a family matching the Jensen's description in a remote area of Rocky Mountain National Park. The family had seemed disoriented and refused help, disappearing into thick forest before the hiker could get a closer look. We sent detailed photographs and descriptions to Colorado authorities, but their investigation found no trace of the supposed sighting. Later, we learned the reporting hiker had a history of attention-seeking behavior and fabricated stories. This became a pattern over the years. Well-meaning people who thought they had seen the Jensen family in various locations across the western United States. Each report was investigated, each one ultimately leading nowhere. Some were cases of mistaken identity. Others were entirely fabricated, and a few seemed to be genuine attempts to help, but based on misremembered details or wishful thinking. The emotional toll on Michael's brother was enormous. Each false lead raised hopes that were inevitably crushed. By 1992, 8 years after the disappearance, I had begun to accept that the Jensen case might never be solved. The file was thick with reports, photographs, and theories, but no closer to resolution than it had been on day 1. I continued to visit Jensen Point during my annual hiking trips, partly from professional obligation and partly from personal obsession. The spot had remained remarkably unchanged. The same rocks, the same trees, the same inexplicable sense that something significant had happened there. The area around Jensen Point had become a sort of pilgrimage site for people interested in unexplained disappearances. Amateur investigators, paranormal enthusiasts, and true crime aficionados would make special trips to the location, taking photographs and conducting their own investigations. Rangers eventually had to post signs asking visitors to respect the area and not disturb potential evidence, though by that point, thousands of hikers had passed through, obliterating any trace evidence that might have remained. In 1993, a breakthrough seemed to come from an unexpected source. A geology professor from UC Berkeley was conducting a routine survey of rock formations in the area when his equipment detected an unusual anomaly about half a mile from Jensen Point. Ground-penetrating radar suggested a void or cave system that wasn't shown on any existing maps. A team was assembled to investigate, including myself and several members of the original search team. The excavation took 3 weeks and revealed a natural cave system that had been sealed by a rockslide decades earlier. The cave was large enough to accommodate several people and had evidence of being used as shelter at some point in the past. We found remains of campfires, some metal objects that might have been camping equipment, and fragments of fabric. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that we had finally found where the Jensen family had taken shelter, perhaps injured and unable to call for help. Forensic analysis of the materials found in the cave was heartbreaking. The fabric fragments were from clothing styles that dated to the 1950s, and the metal objects were identified as World War II-era camping gear. The remains of the campfires were decades old, probably from hunters or trappers who had used the cave for shelter long before the Jensen family had ever visited the area. Carbon dating confirmed that nothing in the cave was connected to their 1984 disappearance. The discovery of the cave did lead to one significant development. A review of historical records revealed that at least 3 other families had disappeared in the same general area over the past 50 years. None of these cases had been connected before because they occurred in different decades and were handled by different agencies. The patterns were remarkably similar. Well-prepared hikers who vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of what had happened to them. This revelation sparked a new investigation, this time coordinated between multiple agencies and spanning several decades of cold cases. FBI behavioral analysts were brought in to look for patterns that might suggest a serial perpetrator. Geological experts examined the area for natural hazards that might explain the disappearances. Even military personnel were consulted to determine if there might be classified activities in the region that could account for people vanishing. The expanded investigation ultimately found no evidence of serial crime, no natural phenomena that could explain the disappearances, and no classified military activities in the area. Each case remained as mysterious as when it was first reported. The only common factors were the location, all within a 5-mile radius of Jensen Point, and the complete absence of any trace evidence. It was as if the mountain occasionally swallowed people whole, leaving behind only questions. By 1994, 10 years after the Jensen family had vanished, the expanded investigation was quietly shelved. The families of all the missing persons continued to hope for answers, but law enforcement resources had to be directed toward cases with more promising leads. The Jensen case file was transferred to the Cold Case Archive, joining dozens of other unsolved mysteries that haunted the careers of everyone who had worked on them. I kept copies of all the important documents and photographs, unable to completely let go of the case that had defined so much of my professional life. My colleagues understood the obsession. Every detective has that one case that never stops bothering them. The puzzle that seems solvable if only you could find the right piece. For me, that case was the Jensen family, and I knew it always would be. The mid-1990s brought technological advances that offered new hope for cold cases like the Jensen disappearance. Enhanced satellite imagery, improved search equipment, and better communication tools promised to revolutionize missing persons investigations. I'd been watching these developments closely, waiting for something that might finally break open the case that had consumed 10 years of my career. In 1995, 11 years after the disappearance, we got our first real break, though it would be years before we understood its significance. A team of researchers from Stanford University was conducting an archaeological survey of Native American sites in the Sierra Nevada when they made an unusual discovery. About 2 miles from Jensen Point, they found evidence of what appeared to be a large camp or gathering place that had been used repeatedly over many years. The site contained artifacts spanning several decades, from the 1940s through the 1980s. Most were typical camping items, tent stakes, can openers, pieces of cookware, but there were also personal items that seemed out of place in a temporary campsite. Children's toys, family photographs, jewelry and clothing that appeared to have been carefully arranged rather than simply discarded. The researchers were puzzled by the site's organization and the condition of the items. When I visited the archaeological site, something about it felt immediately wrong. The personal items were too well preserved, too carefully arranged, almost like a memorial or shrine. Among the artifacts were items that could have belonged to the Jensen family. A child's hiking boot in David's size, a metal compass similar to one Michael had owned, fragments of a journal with pages that might have matched Emma's handwriting. But might have wasn't enough for a positive identification. The Stanford team agreed to extensive testing of the artifacts. DNA analysis was performed on any items that might retain biological traces, and handwriting experts examined the journal fragments. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. Some tests suggested possible connections to the Jensen family, but nothing was definitive enough to be considered evidence. The site raised more questions than it answered. What troubled me most about the archaeological site was its location. It wasn't visible from any established trail, hidden in a depression between 2 ridges that would require deliberate navigation to find. Yet it showed evidence of regular use over many decades. Who had been using this site? Why had they collected these personal items? And most importantly, how were these artifacts connected to the families that had disappeared in the area? The discovery of the site led to a renewed search effort, this time focused on the previously unexplored terrain between Jensen Point and the archaeological site. Using new GPS technology and systematic grid searches, teams combed through areas that had been dismissed in earlier investigations as too remote or inaccessible for a family day hike. What we found challenged everything we thought we knew about the case. Hidden throughout the 2-mile corridor between Jensen Point and the archaeological site were dozens of small caches of personal items. Most were buried or hidden under rocks, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The items ranged from recent to decades old, and many appeared to be missing person cases from across the western United States. Watches, rings, wallets, photographs. Each cache contained 3 to 5 items that seemed to represent different people or families. The pattern was systematic and deliberate. Someone had been collecting these items for decades, hiding them in carefully planned locations across the mountainous terrain. Each cache was marked with small rock cairns that would be invisible to casual hikers but clearly identifiable to someone who knew the system. The scale of the operation was staggering. We eventually found over 200 individual caches spread across nearly 50 square miles. Among the cached items, we found definitive proof that some belonged to the Jensen family. Michael's driver's license, Linda's wedding ring, Emma's journal, mostly intact, and David's stuffed animal that he had left on his hotel bed. The items were in remarkable condition, carefully preserved in waterproof containers. But their presence in these hidden caches raised terrifying questions about what had happened to their owners. The FBI was called in to coordinate the investigation of what was now clearly a major crime scene. Behavioral analysts concluded that the systematic collection and caching of personal items indicated an organized perpetrator who had been operating for decades. The careful preservation of the items suggested someone with extensive knowledge of the area who visited the caches regularly to maintain them. The investigation expanded to include missing persons cases across the entire western United States. We began to identify items that matched cases in Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado. Some of the oldest items dated back to the 1940s, suggesting that either a single perpetrator had been active for over 40 years, or that multiple people were involved in what amounted to a serial killing operation spanning generations. As news of the discovery broke, the media attention was intense. The story of the Jensen family had already captured public imagination, but the revelation that they might have been victims of a decades-long serial killer operation shocked the nation. Families of missing persons from across the country contacted our office, hoping that their loved ones' items might be among those we had recovered. The task of cataloging and identifying the cached items became a massive undertaking involving law enforcement agencies from 12 states. Each item had to be photographed, tested for DNA evidence, and cross-referenced with missing persons databases dating back to the 1940s. The process was complicated by the fact that many older cases had incomplete records, and some of the items were too degraded for reliable testing. What emerged from this analysis was a picture of systematic predation that spanned generations. The items represented at least 40 different missing persons cases, including several that had never been officially reported. Some of the unidentified items apparently belonged to transients, runaways, or people whose disappearances had been attributed to natural causes or accidents. The true scope of the crimes was staggering. The behavioral profile developed by FBI analysts painted a picture of an organized, intelligent perpetrator who knew the mountains intimately. Someone who could navigate the difficult terrain, had access to the area over many decades, and possessed the skills to eliminate victims without leaving trace evidence. The geographical pattern suggested someone local, possibly with generational ties to the region. Investigation of local residents who fit the profile proved challenging. Many families had lived in the area for generations, and the mountainous terrain made it difficult to monitor or investigate remote properties. Several potential suspects emerged, long-time residents with extensive wilderness skills and the opportunity to operate undetected, but none had conclusive evidence linking them to the crimes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing historical records for the area, researchers discovered that a significant portion of the land where the caches were found had been owned by the same family for over 60 years. The property had been used as a hunting lodge and wilderness retreat, providing perfect cover for someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain. The property owners were the Kellerman family, who had operated the remote lodge since the 1930s. Tom Kellerman, the ranger who had led the initial search for the Jensen family, was the current generation of the family managing the property. When investigators realized that the man who had been most involved in searching for missing persons was connected to land where their belongings were being cached, the case took on a horrifying new dimension. The investigation of Tom Kellerman revealed a complex picture. He had been involved in search and rescue operations for over 20 years, participating in nearly every major missing persons case in the region. His intimate knowledge of the mountains, combined with his position of trust within the law enforcement community, had provided perfect cover for his activities. He had literally been helping to search for people he had killed. When confronted with the evidence, Kellerman initially denied any involvement. He claimed that someone else must have been using his family's property to cache the items, possibly without his knowledge. But as the investigation deepened, more connections emerged. Several witnesses remembered Kellerman being in contact with missing persons shortly before their disappearances, often offering advice about hiking routes or local conditions. The most damning evidence came from Kellerman's own records. As a park ranger, he had access to hiking permits and registration information. Analysis of his duty schedule showed that he had been working on the days when most of the missing persons had last been seen. His detailed knowledge of planned hiking routes had allowed him to intercept victims in remote areas where their disappearances wouldn't be immediately noticed. Under intense questioning, Kellerman eventually confessed to multiple murders spanning over 20 years. His method was disturbingly simple. He would encounter families or individuals on remote trails, claiming to be conducting official park business. He would then lead them away from established trails to isolated areas where he could kill them without risk of discovery. The bodies were buried in remote locations that he would never reveal, even under pressure. Kellerman's confession explained the mystery of Jensen Point. The family had encountered him on the trail that morning, and he had convinced them to follow him to what he claimed was a more scenic route. Once away from the main trail, he had killed all 4 family members and buried their bodies in a location he had prepared specifically for such purposes. The personal items had been kept as trophies, carefully preserved and cached, according to a system he had developed over decades. The revelation that a trusted park ranger had been systematically murdering hikers for over 20 years sent shockwaves through the outdoor community. Kellerman had been respected, even beloved, by colleagues and visitors alike. He had received commendations for his search and rescue work, including efforts to find people he had killed. The betrayal of trust was almost incomprehensible. Tom Kellerman's arrest in the spring of 1996 marked the end of one of the most complex serial murder investigations in California history. But even with a confession, many questions remained unanswered. Kellerman refused to reveal the locations where he had buried his victims, claiming that the families didn't deserve closure after the trouble they had caused him. His callousness toward the suffering he had inflicted was chilling, even to experienced homicide investigators. The legal proceedings were complicated by the span of time over which the crimes had occurred and the multiple jurisdictions involved. Kellerman was ultimately charged with 37 counts of first-degree murder, including the Jensen family. Several of the older cases couldn't be prosecuted due to statute of limitations issues, though Kellerman's confession left no doubt about his guilt in those crimes as well. During the trial, disturbing details emerged about Kellerman's methodology and psychology. He had begun killing as a teenager in the 1960s, starting with individual hikers before progressing to families. His position as a park ranger had provided ideal cover. He could monitor potential victims through permit applications, predict their movements, and participate in search efforts when they were reported missing. The systematic nature of his crimes was unprecedented. Kellerman's defense team attempted to argue that his confessions were unreliable, prompted by interrogation pressure and the desire to claim responsibility for unsolved cases. However, the physical evidence from the cached items, combined with detailed knowledge of crime scenes that only the perpetrator could possess, made his guilt undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentencing phase revealed the full scope of Kellerman's crimes. Families of victims gave impact statements describing decades of uncertainty and grief. Michael Jensen's brother spoke about the scholarship fund he had established and his determination to continue searching for answers even after learning the terrible truth. The emotional weight of 37 destroyed families was overwhelming for everyone in the courtroom. Kellerman was sentenced to death, though he showed no remorse during the proceedings. In his final statement to the court, he claimed that his victims had trespassed on his mountains and deserved their fate. He expressed particular satisfaction in having participated in search efforts for people he had killed, describing it as his greatest accomplishment. The complete absence of empathy or humanity in his statements was profoundly disturbing. Following Kellerman's conviction, efforts began to locate the burial sites of his victims. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and extensive excavation efforts were launched across the mountainous terrain he had controlled. Despite months of searching and multiple attempts to pressure Kellerman for information, no bodies were recovered. He had chosen burial sites that would likely never be discovered, denying closure to the families even in death. The Jensen family case, which had mystified investigators for 12 years, was finally closed, but the resolution brought little satisfaction to those who had worked on it. The revelation that a trusted law enforcement officer had been systematically murdering the people he was supposed to protect felt like a betrayal of everything we believed about public service and human nature. In the aftermath of Kellerman's conviction, significant changes were made to park service protocols. Rangers were required to work in pairs in remote areas, and new tracking systems were implemented to monitor employee movements. Background checks were enhanced, and psychological evaluations became mandatory for positions involving public trust. The changes came too late for Kellerman's victims, but might prevent future tragedies. The property where the cached items were found was turned over to federal authorities and eventually became a memorial site. Families of victims were allowed to retrieve their loved ones' belongings, though many found the experience more traumatic than healing. The careful preservation of personal items, which Kellerman had clearly taken pride in, felt like a final violation of privacy and dignity. As I reflect on the Jensen case and its resolution, I'm struck by how completely we had been deceived. For 12 years, Tom Kellerman had been one of our most trusted colleagues, a man whose dedication to finding missing persons seemed unquestionable. He had attended strategy meetings, offered insights into the case, and expressed genuine seeming concern for the family's fate. The psychological manipulation was masterful and deeply disturbing. The case taught me that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, that those who present themselves as protectors might be predators, and that our assumptions about human nature can be dangerously naive. The Jensen family had done everything right. They had followed all safety protocols, informed authorities of their plans, and trusted a park ranger who offered to help them. Their trust had cost them their lives. The years following Kellerman's conviction were marked by a slow healing process for the families affected by his crimes. The knowledge of what had happened provided closure in some ways, but also created new forms of trauma. Many families struggled with the realization that their loved ones had suffered at the hands of someone they should have been able to trust completely. Michael Jensen's brother David established a foundation dedicated to improving wilderness safety and supporting families of missing persons. The foundation funded new communication technologies for remote areas, provided grants for search and rescue training, and offered counseling services for families dealing with unexplained disappearances. It became a fitting memorial to a family whose trust and love of the outdoors had been so brutally violated. In 1999, 3 years after Kellerman's conviction, I retired from active police work but continued consulting on cold cases. The Jensen investigation had shaped my entire career, teaching me to question assumptions and look beyond obvious explanations. I frequently spoke at law enforcement conferences about the case, emphasizing how easily a trusted insider could manipulate investigations from within. The impact on the Park Service was profound and lasting. Tom Kellerman had been a respected ranger for over 20 years, known for his dedication and expertise. Discovering that he had been using his position to hunt human prey destroyed morale and forced a complete reassessment of hiring and oversight practices. Many rangers who had worked alongside him for years questioned their own judgment and struggled with feelings of betrayal. The wilderness areas where Kellerman had operated saw a significant decline in visitors following the revelation of his crimes. Many people who had hiked those trails for years found themselves unable to return, haunted by the knowledge of what had taken place in locations they had considered safe and beautiful. The psychological impact on the outdoor community was immeasurable. Despite intensive efforts, none of Kellerman's victims were ever recovered. He maintained his silence about burial locations even as his appeals were exhausted and his execution date approached. In 2003, he died of natural causes on death row, taking the secrets of where he had hidden his victims to his grave. For the families, this final act of selfishness was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. The cached items became the focus of extensive research into Kellerman's psychology and methods. Criminal psychologists studied the careful preservation and organization of the belongings, trying to understand the mindset of someone who took such pride in maintaining trophies of his crimes. The systematic nature of the caches suggested a level of planning and forethought that was deeply disturbing. In 2005, 21 years after the Jensen family's disappearance, I received an unexpected phone call. A documentary filmmaker was working on a project about the case and wanted to interview me about the investigation. I was reluctant at first. The case had been closed for nearly a decade, and I wasn't sure there was value in revisiting such painful memories. But ultimately, I agreed to participate. The documentary process forced me to review evidence and interviews I hadn't examined in years. Looking back at photographs from the original search, I could see Tom Kellerman in several images, always helpful, always concerned, always volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. Knowing what I knew then, his behavior seemed transparently suspicious, but at the time he had simply appeared to be a dedicated professional. One detail that struck me during the documentary interviews was how Kellerman had inserted himself into virtually every aspect of the investigation. He had been present when the tracking dogs lost the scent, had suggested search areas that ultimately proved fruitless, and had been among the most vocal advocates for expanding the search radius. In hindsight, his behavior was clearly designed to waste resources and lead investigators away from productive avenues. The documentary, when it aired in 2006, brought renewed attention to the case and to the broader issue of how trusted officials can abuse their positions. It featured interviews with family members, investigators, and psychological experts who analyzed Kellerman's methods and motivations. The film was difficult to watch, but it served an important purpose in educating the public about how predators can exploit positions of trust. Following the documentary's release, I was contacted by investigators from other jurisdictions who suspected they might have cases connected to Kellerman or others using similar methods. The pattern of using official positions to gain victims' trust and then leading them to isolated areas had been used by other criminals, though none with Kellerman's systematic approach or longevity. The Jensen case file, which had once been confined to a few boxes in my office, eventually filled an entire archive room. Every aspect of the investigation was preserved, from the original search reports to the psychological profiles of Kellerman. It served as a resource for law enforcement training and academic research into serial predation and institutional betrayal. As the 2000s progressed, the Jensen case began to fade from public memory, becoming a footnote in criminal justice textbooks and a cautionary tale told in law enforcement academies. But for those of us who had lived through the investigation, the lessons learned continued to influence how we approached every case. The realization that evil could hide behind trusted uniforms and friendly faces had fundamentally changed our perspective on human nature. In 2008, nearly 25 years after the family's disappearance, I was contacted by a graduate student researching the psychological impact of long-term missing persons cases on investigating officers. She was particularly interested in cases where the resolution had been more traumatic than the initial mystery. The Jensen case was a perfect example of how learning the truth could be worse than living with uncertainty. During our interview, the graduate student asked me something that I had never considered before: whether I believed there might be other Tom Kellermans out there, trusted officials using their positions to prey on vulnerable people. The question haunted me because the answer was almost certainly yes. Kellerman's methods were too effective, too well developed for him to be a unique case. Someone, somewhere, was probably using similar tactics at that very moment. This realization led me to begin consulting with other agencies on cases where trusted officials might be involved in disappearances. Over the next few years, I worked on several investigations where park rangers, law enforcement officers, or other authority figures had been suspected of crimes against the people they were supposed to protect. While none matched the scope of Kellerman's operation, several cases were resolved by applying lessons learned from the Jensen investigation. The wilderness areas where Kellerman had operated gradually returned to normal use, though some locations remained forever changed. Jensen Point, where the family's trail had gone cold, was eventually marked with a small memorial plaque. The text simply read, "In memory of the Jensen family and all those who found peace in these mountains." Indeed, it was deliberately vague, avoiding the horrible details of what had actually occurred there. In 2010, I was invited to speak at a conference on wilderness safety, where I met several other investigators who had worked on similar cases. We formed an informal network of professionals who specialized in crimes involving trusted officials and isolated locations. The network proved valuable for sharing information and identifying patterns that might not be apparent to investigators working in isolation. One of the most disturbing revelations from our network was how common these crimes might be. Many missing persons cases in remote areas had never been thoroughly investigated, simply classified as accidents or assumed to be people who had chosen to disappear. Reviewing these cases with the knowledge gained from the Jensen investigation revealed suspicious patterns in dozens of disappearances across the western United States. The technology that had finally broken the Jensen case continued to evolve. Ground-penetrating radar became more sophisticated, DNA analysis became faster and more reliable, and satellite imagery provided unprecedented views of remote areas. Each advancement offered hope that other cold cases might finally be resolved, though none would likely match the systematic evidence preservation that had made the Jensen case solvable. In 2012, I received news that would have seemed impossible during the original investigation. A team of researchers, using advanced satellite imaging, had identified potential burial sites in the area where Kellerman had operated. The technology could detect subtle changes in vegetation and soil composition that might indicate disturbed ground from decades earlier. For the first time since his arrest, there was hope that some of his victims might finally be recovered. The excavation effort was massive, involving multiple agencies and advanced archaeological techniques. Over a period of 6 months, teams systematically investigated dozens of sites identified by satellite analysis. The work was painstaking and often heartbreaking, as false alarms raised and dashed hopes repeatedly, but eventually the effort began to yield results. The first remains recovered were identified as belonging to a family from Oregon who had disappeared in 1978. The discovery validated the satellite imaging technology and provided long-awaited closure for a family that had spent 34 years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. More discoveries followed, though at a heartbreakingly slow pace. Despite the technological advances and expanded search efforts, the Jensen family's remains were never found. Kellerman had chosen their burial site too well, hiding them in a location that even advanced imaging couldn't reveal. For Michael's brother David, now an elderly man who had spent nearly 3 decades searching for answers, the continued absence of his family's bodies remained a source of profound grief. As I write this account in 2013, nearly 30 years after the Jensen family walked into the mountains and never returned, their case remains one of the most significant in my career. It taught me that evil can be patient, systematic, and devastatingly effective when combined with intelligence and authority. It showed me that the people we trust most might be the ones we should fear most. And it demonstrated that sometimes learning the truth can be more painful than living with mystery. The case that had begun with 4 missing hikers had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive study of how predators exploit positions of trust and how institutions can unknowingly enable systematic evil. By 2014, 30 years after the Jensen family's disappearance, their story had become a cornerstone case study in criminal justice programs across the country. But in late 2014, an unexpected development would add a new and disturbing chapter to the case. A wildlife photographer, using a commercial drone to document environmental changes in the Sierra Nevada, made a discovery that would reignite interest in the Jensen case and raise new questions about what we thought we knew about their final moments. The photographer, Janet Morrison, no relation to me, was conducting a routine survey of erosion patterns in the mountains when her drone captured something unusual carved into a cliff face about 3 miles from Jensen Point. The carving was weathered and partially obscured by lichen, but high-resolution photography revealed what appeared to be human names and a date etched into the rock face approximately 30 feet above the ground. When the images were enhanced and analyzed, the carved text became legible. Jensen family 1984, we are here. The discovery sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the families affected by Kellerman's crimes. After 30 years, the Jensen family had seemingly reached out from beyond the grave to communicate something to the world they had been forced to leave behind. The location of the carving was significant. It was in an area that had been searched extensively during the original investigation, but the cliff face was too high and dangerous for ground teams to examine closely. The carving could only be seen clearly from the air, and only with the enhanced imaging capabilities that hadn't existed in 1984. It was as if the family had left a message that could only be discovered when technology advanced enough to reveal it. Analysis of the carving by geological experts confirmed that it had been made approximately 30 years earlier, consistent with the 1984 date etched into the rock. The tool mark suggested the use of a metal implement, possibly a knife or small axe. The positioning and depth of the cuts indicated that whoever had made the carving had spent considerable time on the cliff face, working carefully, despite the dangerous location. The discovery raised profound questions about the timeline of the Jensen family's disappearance. According to Kellerman's confession, he had killed them quickly after leading them away from the main trail. But the carving suggested that at least one family member had survived long enough to climb to a nearly inaccessible cliff face and carve a message. Had Kellerman lied about the details of their deaths? Had someone escaped his initial attack? A new investigation was launched, this time focused on the area around the cliff carving. Advanced ground-penetrating radar was used to search for possible cave systems or hidden shelters where someone might have taken refuge. Rock-climbing experts were brought in to examine the cliff face for evidence of how someone had accessed the carving location. Every possibility was explored with the urgency of a case that might still have living victims. The technical analysis of the cliff approach revealed that reaching the carving location would have required significant climbing skill and equipment. The rock face was nearly vertical and offered few handholds, making it unlikely that children could have made the climb without assistance. This suggested that either Michael or Linda Jensen had somehow escaped Kellerman's initial attack and made a desperate attempt to leave evidence of what had happened to them. During the renewed investigation, a disturbing possibility emerged. Crime scene analysts noted that the carving was positioned to be visible from the direction of Kellerman's family property, almost as if it had been intended as a message specifically for him. The careful positioning and the defiant tone of "we are here" suggested that whoever had made the carving knew they were being hunted and wanted to ensure their persecutor knew they had not gone quietly into death. The investigation team attempted to re-interview Tom Kellerman about the carving, but he had died in prison 11 years earlier, taking his secrets with him. His former colleagues and family members were questioned about whether he had ever mentioned anything about carvings or messages left by victims, but none had any useful information. Kellerman had been secretive about his crimes even with those closest to him. Attempts to access Kellerman's personal property and belongings revealed another shocking discovery. Hidden in a secret compartment in his cabin were dozens of photographs taken from various locations around the mountains where he had operated. Many of the photographs showed cliff faces and rock formations taken from angles that suggested they had been shot to document messages or carvings. The Jensen carving was not among the photographed locations, suggesting it might have been made after Kellerman's final visit to the area. Analysis of Kellerman's photographs revealed at least 12 other locations where victims had apparently left messages carved into rock faces or trees. Most were simple, initials and dates, but a few contained desperate pleas for help or defiant final statements. The photographs suggested that some of Kellerman's victims had survived his initial attacks long enough to leave evidence of their presence, evidence that he had apparently taken pride in documenting and preserving. This revelation fundamentally changed our understanding of Kellerman's methodology. Rather than the quick, efficient killer he had portrayed himself as, he appeared to have engaged in extended psychological torture, allowing victims to believe they might escape while hunting them through the wilderness. The carvings and messages were evidence of their desperate attempts to leave some trace of their existence for the world to find. The discovery of multiple victim messages carved throughout the mountains where Kellerman had operated opened up an entirely new dimension to the case. Each carving told a story of desperate people trying to leave some trace of their existence, some evidence that they had fought against their fate until the very end. The Jensen family carving was just one of many final testimonies scattered across the wilderness like grave markers without graves. In 2015, a comprehensive mapping project was launched to locate and document all of the message sites identified in Kellerman's photographs. The project involved rock climbing specialists, archaeologists, and criminal investigators working together to access remote cliff faces and hidden locations throughout the Sierra Nevada. Each newly discovered carving provided heartbreaking insight into the final hours or days of people who had trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. The most disturbing discovery came at a location about 5 miles from Jensen Point, where investigators found evidence of what appeared to be a temporary shelter or hiding place carved into a rock overhang. The shelter contained remnants of camping equipment, clothing fragments, and several carved messages that suggested multiple people had used the location over many years. Analysis of the messages revealed they had been made by different victims across different time periods, indicating that Kellerman had used this location repeatedly as part of his hunting ground. Among the messages found at the shelter site was one that appeared to be from Linda Jensen, carved in handwriting that matched samples from her teaching materials. The message read, "Kept us here 3 days. Kids are safe hidden. He doesn't know. Tell David we love him." The reference to David initially confused investigators until they realized she was referring to Michael's brother, not her son. The message suggested that the family had been held captive for several days before their deaths, contradicting everything Kellerman had confessed about quick killings. The revelation that the Jensen children might have been hidden somewhere, possibly still alive when their mother carved her message, launched the most intensive search effort since the original 1984 investigation. Every cave, overhang, and hidden space within miles of the shelter site was systematically examined. Sadly, no trace of the children was found, but the search did reveal additional evidence of Kellerman's systematic use of the area for his crimes. DNA analysis of material found at various carving sites confirmed the presence of multiple families who had been reported missing over the decades. The evidence painted a picture of Kellerman as not just a killer, but as someone who had turned murder into an elaborate game of cat and mouse, prolonging his victims' suffering for his own psychological gratification. The quick, efficient deaths he had confessed to were apparently lies designed to minimize the true horror of his crimes. The final piece of the puzzle came in late 2015 when advanced ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly near the cliff where the Jensen family carving had been found. Excavation revealed a carefully concealed entrance to a natural cave system that extended deep into the mountain. Inside the cave, investigators found evidence that it had been used as a long-term hiding place, possibly where victims were held before being killed. The cave contained personal belongings from dozens of victims, preserved in the cool, dry environment. Among these items were Michael Jensen's watch, still keeping accurate time after 31 years, and a small backpack that had belonged to David Jensen. Most significantly, they found Emma Jensen's journal, nearly complete, documenting the family's 3-day ordeal in the mountains before their deaths. Emma's journal entries provided the first detailed account of what had happened to the Jensen family after they encountered Tom Kellerman on the trail that July morning in 1984. Her writing, mature beyond her 12 years, described how Kellerman had convinced them to follow him to what he claimed was a more scenic route. She wrote about her growing unease as they moved farther from established trails, and her parents' attempts to maintain calm while clearly becoming suspicious of their guide. The journal revealed that Kellerman had led them to the hidden cave system, claiming it contained ancient Native American artifacts that few people were allowed to see. Once inside, he had trapped them, blocking the cave entrance and leaving them with minimal food and water. Emma's entries documented their desperate attempts to escape, their efforts to ration their limited supplies, and their gradual realization that they were not going to survive. The final entry in Emma's journal, written in handwriting that grew progressively weaker, simply read, "If someone finds this, tell Uncle David we tried to come home. We carved our name where everyone can see. We were here. We existed. We loved each other until the end." The raw emotion and mature acceptance in a 12-year-old's final words was devastating to everyone who read it. The discovery of the cave and Emma's journal finally provided complete closure to the Jensen family case. The remains of all 4 family members were found in a hidden chamber deeper in the cave system, laid out with a care that seemed inconsistent with Kellerman's brutality, but consistent with a family that had faced death together. They had apparently died of dehydration and starvation after being trapped in the cave for several days. Michael Jensen's brother David, now in his 70s, was finally able to lay his family to rest in a proper ceremony. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including investigators, park rangers, and members of the hiking community who had been touched by the family's story. The Jensen Scholarship Fund, which had helped dozens of young people pursue careers in outdoor education, was renamed in memory of Emma's courage and determination to leave a record of their existence. The case that had begun with 4 missing hikers and evolved into one of the most complex serial murder investigations in American history was finally closed. But the lessons learned from the Jensen family's ordeal continue to influence law enforcement training, wilderness safety protocols, and our understanding of how evil can hide behind trusted facades. Their story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those we have the least reason to fear. What do you think really happened to the Jensen family during those 3 terrifying days in the cave? The journal entries paint a heartbreaking picture, but they also raise questions about whether there might be details we still don't know. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of this case disturb you the most?